Let's turn now to Matthew's Gospel and chapter 25 and verse 14. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, Jesus said, another parable in relation to the second coming of Christ and how we can be ready for it. A man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To the one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. Now each of these talents was a massive amount of money in terms of silver content and much more in terms of buying power. And immediately, verse 16, the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. And after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have gained 5 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Now here we see that the Lord taught responsibility to his disciples according to the measure in which God had given them talents to use. We could apply that to all of God's gifts to us. We have a responsibility, finally, to answer to God, to account for everything that we have received. And here, the important thing is not how much we produce. In the world, the emphasis is on quantity. But with the Lord, the emphasis is on quality. It's not how much we produce. It is a question of faithfulness with what we have. And that is the point of this parable. Because the one who had 5 talents produced 5 more. His gain was 100%. The one who received only 2 talents produced 2 more. His gain was also 100%. And when they stood before the Lord, and the man with 5 talents gave his extra 5, and the one with 2 talents showed the extra 2 he had gained, the master gave both of them exactly the same commendation in verse 21 and verse 23. Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Word for word, identically the same, proving that in the final day, our rewards will not depend on how much we have produced, but it will depend on how faithful we have been with what God gave us. If God gave you only 2 talents, and say he gave another brother 50, in the final day, that brother will have to produce 50 more to get the same reward as you, who produced 2 more. It's a question of percentage, not a question of total. It's a question of quality, not a question of quantity. It's a question of faithfulness, not a question of the extent of our influence. With what God gave you, what did you produce? We can apply this to many areas. For example, with the time God gave you. All of us have spare time. Some have more spare time than others. For example, those who are married and with many children and many responsibilities and late working hours in the office don't have much spare time. We can say that they are like brothers who got 2 talents as far as time is concerned. There are many other single brothers and sisters who have plenty of spare time. They are like those who have 5 or 10 talents. And in the final day, when the Lord examines each one, He's going to examine each one according to how much time they had. How did they use their spare time? We have energy. health. Not all have the same. Some have a greater measure of health and energy than others, and God is going to evaluate us on the basis of how we used what He gave us. Money is another area where there are a lot of differences. Some have more money, others have less. They are not going to be evaluated on the same basis. It's not a question of whether you gave 100 rupees to the Lord's work or 1 rupee. It's not a question of quantity. Jesus Himself said that a widow who put in 2 mites had actually put more into the box than all the wealthy Pharisees who had put in much more. It is not a question of quantity. It was a question of percentage. The widow gave 100%, even though it was only 2 mites. So we see that in the parables of Jesus and the teaching of the New Testament, it is quality that God looks for. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 12 to 15, also makes it clear that the fire will test the quality of each man's work, whether it's gold, silver, and precious stones, or wood, hay, and straw. And so also here, we have a responsibility with what God has given us, whether it's time or health or money. It could be influence. Maybe God has given you influence over a number of people. Have you used that influence for God? Others have less influence. They are not expected to produce so much as you. There are many material gifts and abilities God has given to us. Have you used them for the Lord? Maybe as children. God's given you 5 children. He's given another one only 1 or 2. You have to raise up 5 children for the Lord. He has to raise up only 2 for the Lord. The question is, did you raise your children for the Lord, or did you raise them for the world? What did you use your talent for? Here we read of a man who had 1 talent. What did he do with it? He buried it in the ground. That is like using your talent for the things of earth. To bury it in the ground, to bury it in the earth, is to use our talent for the things of earth. And that is as good as not using it for God at all. And so there are no returns that come from it for God. The returns are nil. And there are many people who are using their time, their money, their energy, burying it in the ground in the sense that they're using it for the things of earth, for the things of time, which will pass away so quickly. And in effect, no returns are coming for the Lord from that gift which God gave for them to use. We know the story of the prodigal son. We can think that the prodigal son is just a picture of a person who is an outright sinner. But think of yourself in that picture. What did the son do? He received gifts from the father, and he used it all for himself. To receive gifts from God and to use it all for myself is to be a prodigal son, even if you're not a backslider or an outright sinner. To use our time, our energy, our money, our health for God, that is to be a wise and faithful steward. To raise our children, every one of them, for God and not for the world. How many believers are there who do that? Most believers want their children to live and become great in the world. To raise our children for God does not mean we train them all to be full-time Christian workers. We can raise them up to be in secular occupations, but they must live for God in their secular occupations. This is the point. So, everything that God gives is to be used for Him. It could also apply to spiritual talents and gifts. There are spiritual gifts God gives us. He has given more to some, less to others. A man like Paul was an apostle and a prophet and a shepherd and a teacher and an evangelist, all rolled in one. There are others who may have only 1 gift. But however many we have, the important thing is, have we buried it in the ground? Have we used it for our own honor, to make money for ourselves? Or have we used it for God? If we have used it for God, we have invested it wisely. If we used it for ourselves, it has been buried in the earth. This is the way to find out whether we fall into the category of those who invested their talents or the one who buried it in the ground. Do I use it for myself, or do I use it for God? The one who uses it for himself, material or spiritual gifts, is like the one who buried it in the ground. And when the master came, the one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man. reaping where you did not sow, verse 24, gathering where you scattered no seed. He had a wrong understanding of his master. His relationship with his master was a legalistic relationship, like people knew God under the law. It was not one of grace. He thought his master was a hard, exacting man who demanded even to reap where he did not sow. And the result of that type of relationship with God is that a man becomes afraid. There's fear in his life. I was afraid, he says in verse 25. I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. He was legalistic. Here is exactly what you gave me. Here you have it back. But his master answered and said to him, you wicked, lazy slave, such a person is a wicked person. Do you realize that when you use God's gifts for yourself and not for the glory of God, you're a wicked person? You knew that I reap where I did not sow. I gather where I scattered no seed. He's using his own words. Of course, the master was not like that, but he was quoting his own words to him and saying, then you ought to have put my money at least in the bank so that on my arrival I would have received at least the interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has shall more be given, and he shall have an abundance. And from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. What does this mean? It looks unrighteous, doesn't it, to give to the one who already has? But the meaning is, everyone who has obedience, to him more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But the one who does not have obedience, even what he does have will be taken away from him. The one who uses what God gives him, God will give him more. When you're faithful in your little circle, God will expand your circle. But if we are unfaithful there and live for ourselves, even the little circle we have, complaining that the circle is so little, then it says, cast out the worthless stave into the outer darkness. In that place there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then we are exactly like the unbelievers.